Marginal victories is Ukraine gets back a bit of territory, or it just prevents the Russians from taking more, and it eventually has to accept that its eastern part has been lost, or it's no longer able to govern it, or whatever. Or a marginal victory for the Russians, which is they keep the territory that they own, and maybe they accept that the Ukrainians do join the EU, but not NATO.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing for the singing of our national anthem.
Brexit means Brexit.
My administration has accomplished more than almost any administration in the history of our country.
Hi, hello and welcome. I'm Royfield Brown and I am in Birmingham. It is 2024, it's the start of a new year, and what I thought we'd do is take a snapshot. Let's get our crystal balls out. Let's prognosticate with a good friend of mine, Pyotr Kurzin from the Global Gambit podcast. If you don't know of him, he's doing great things over there on the YouTubes, and also his podcast is rather good too. So today what we're going to do is specifically look at the Middle East, but specifically to look at the ICJ and how important that is going to be in 2024. We're going to look at the continuing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. I'll be looking at a partitioning of Ukraine. We're going to look at China, its slowdown of its economy, and also tensions with Taiwan and its new president. We're also going to look at the Horn of Africa. How seismic is the new treaty between Ethiopia and Somaliland? And then we're also going to look at the US and UK elections. But Pyotr, first, Happy New Year, sir. How was your Christmas?
Christmas Day was spent skiing on an Alp, which was very nice. And but still rather stuck to, because when you start a YouTube channel, as I'm sure you'll be learning increasingly, Royfield, and everyone go and subscribe if you haven't already to Royfield's. It becomes kind of obsessive. So even when I was on Christmas Day, I was like, oh, I've got another subscriber, yay! But it was very good, thank you. How was yours?
You know what? Quite quiet. My son is now over here from Canada, so at the moment we're living together. So you know what? It's all new. It's a new year, new experiences. It's all good. So what I thought we'd do first off is to deal with the Middle East. We have a conflict between Israel and Hamas, which is of critical concern for just about everybody. The escalating tensions and the military operations impact regional stability. But specifically though, Pyotr, looking at 2024, I think one of the fascinating aspects of this war has actually been the ICJ, and the fact that South Africa has brought arguments to the ICJ saying, or at least alleging, that Israel is complicit in genocide.
Israel has a genocidal intent against the Palestinians in Gaza. That is evident from the way in which Israel's military attack is being conducted, which has been described by Ms. Hassim SC. It is systematic in its character and form. The mass displacement of the population of Gaza, headed into areas where they continue to be killed, and the deliberate creation of conditions that, quote, lead to a slow death, unquote. There is also the clear pattern of conduct, the targeting of family homes and civilian infrastructure, laying waste to vast areas of Gaza, and the bombing, shelling, and sniping of men, women, and children where they stand, the destruction of the health infrastructure.
The ICJ is complicated enough. International law is complicated enough. You asked me about my Christmas. I spent half my Christmas and New Year period studying an extra qualification in just international humanitarian law, or IHL, because I wanted to have a better understanding of how it can or can't be applied in certain contexts with the Gaza war, because the Gaza war is not just a state v state actor, it's non-state with a territory that is not fully recognized versus another that is kind of not recognized by some others, and all these complexities. I think it's important to keep in mind what the actual case is. So this was brought against Israel on December 29th, accusing it of, quote, genocidal acts. They've been, Palestinian people have been campaigning for months for this sort of thing. And I think it is very symbolic that the South Africans have done this, because they are obviously a country that has, well, they're apartheid, and Israel is accused of apartheid actions by groups like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty. Now, I want to make it very clear that I'm just describing things. I'm not saying whether or not they have. It's way beyond my remit to be able to make such calls like that. But that's the case that South Africa is pushing. This is happening in the ICJ. The ICJ is also called the World Court. It is part of the UN. It's the highest legal body, which is different to the International Criminal Court, which is not part of the UN. The ICJ's jurisdiction is nation states versus the ICC, which is about individuals. So the ICC was more trialing, Milosevic during the Yugoslav cases. The ICJ comprises about 15 judges who are appointed for about 9-year terms, and they represent the member states. So there are already accusations, before we even get into the details, that, because the Security Council is made up of 5 permanent members, of which 3 are Western and more pro-Israel, at least traditionally speaking, it's not a fair balance, versus the 10 elected members, which it varies. And so if South Africa wants to lodge a case against Israel, what if it did it 2 years ago, that would have a very different composition of potential perspectives, because India, Germany versus, say, Jamaica and Guatemala or something. But yeah, so basically they held two days of hearings. The South Africans are demanding that Israel does not continue what it's doing. It stops its military activities, and to use what they called, I think, provisional measures, in basically trying to protect against further severe and, if I remember correctly, irreparable harm to the rights of the Palestinian people under the Geneva Convention, which they said it violated to, quote, impunity. So those are South Africa's demands. They are, trying to push for the Geneva Convention. There's crimes against humanity, war crimes, crimes of aggression, which is the third one, not often utilized. It was in the case of Ukraine, and then genocide. Israel responded by lambasting the case, and that it would defend itself, hitherto. The president called the case, I think, like absurd or preposterous or something, and it constituted blood libel. And their case was more, I think, just a case of rejection, and that this is, they're denying this matter. They would proudly present their case under self-defense.
But I would say that there also is another court, and it's the court of public opinion. And I think it's fairly safe to say that this is such a contentious war, but I think it's fairly safe to say that world opinion has shifted from the original horror of the attacks by Hamas on southern Israel on October 7th to what many people see as a disproportionate Israeli response. We have 70% of the homes in Gaza have been destroyed, 70%, and over 1% of Gazans have been killed.
Unquestionably, I would just add to that. I mean, 10% of the Gazan population has effectively been casualty of the war. 2.3 million, so 23,000. That's a lot. It's like what? It's like 3.3 million in the United States, or 600,000 people in the United Kingdom, or 650,000. It's a lot of people. And just a last point I just want to make is that you're right. The original perception of sympathy for October 7th, astonishment, shock, and horror has now shifted to, well, Israel, many countries around the world, apart from pretty consistent ones in the West, being like, well, no, this is absolutely outrageous, Israel, you are overdoing it, this is unnecessary and disproportionate. However, military analysts would disagree with the term disproportionate, and I know you're going to be like, well, that's semantics, but in law, disproportionality is not based on number of lives lost. It's based on military objectivity. So specifically, Israel has not proportionately reached its objectives because Hamas, which is the perpetrator of the crimes in Israel, have not been dealt with. And therefore, until Israel deals with Hamas, the proportionality thing is not based on casualty rates. I know that sounds completely madness to people who are just like, but they've killed 23,000 Palestinians versus 1,200 Israelis. The militaristic interpretation is very different to us who aren't
I think
people.
that
If
that's
you
a
get
fair
that distinction.
point. And
Yeah.
and that's the reason why, and you or I, and neither of us are experts in international law, and one of the reasons why this case is going to go on so long is because people need to argue quite arcane legal points and their relevance specifically to do with this conflict. But just one thing I wanted to say before we leave the ICJ and Israel, the point that I was going to try and make was that pressure on, let's say, a party like the Labour Party is going to be considerable if you have Keir Starmer being the prime minister, as many people think, let's say in 2025, 2026, when the ICJ might come to a ruling, and a party like the Labour Party, which has been very foremost in wanting a two-state solution, and the pressure that Starmer is under from many of his backbenchers to have more of an overlying censor in Israel, something like the ICJ coming out and, let's say, if they do say that they agree with the South African case against Israel, is going to put a lot of pressure on many Western governments to at least soften their, let's say, blanket support for the state of Israel. So whilst the ICJ cannot implement any of its rulings, it does have this kind of moral authority.
I think that's a great point. And one of the things about the ICJ, we touched upon it, is that how would the decisions go? How do the judges vote? Now, judges are supposed to be impartial, and largely speaking, I think they have towed a pretty impartial line from my very broad analysis of reading into it when I was studying in The Hague and Amsterdam. But they have also voted in line with countries' politics. And so this is your point. We've got a year of 60 countries going to the polls. We just had Taiwan's, we've got America's, we've got Britain's. And so if if the UK is on the ICJ, which it isn't at the moment, what difference could a shift in party politics in the UK have on the voting intentions at the ICJ? Now it doesn't work obviously that quickly and directly, but we could talk about if there's a sudden change in Russia, suddenly Putin isn't in power. Imagine that. I'm kidding, obviously, but it might have, depending upon the other countries that are on the ICJ. If there's any leadership changes, then that might implicitly influence the way that they vote. So that is something to keep in mind as we move ahead with this court case.
Let us move on to Ukraine. You mentioned Putin. As 2024 unfolds, there is growing speculation about whether it will bring a dampening of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, which has significantly impacted regional stability and global politics. The Ukrainian offensive in the summer didn't achieve its objectives, and now the world's attention has really moved to the conflict in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas. Specifically in American politics, there are many Republicans that do not want to continue to fund this war. Are we going to slowly but surely forget this conflict in Russia and Ukraine, and will that then lead to a de facto partitioning of Ukraine? Specifically remembering as well that there's also a Russian election this year.
Yeah, let's just deal with the Russian election right now. It's a slam dunk. Putin is out of power. We're getting in democracy. We're getting in, freedom of expression and a happy go. No, he's going to win again. You have what's called the systemic opposition in Russia, which is made up of the three other largest parties: the Communists, the Liberal Democratic Party, which are ultra nationalists. The name is not. Ignore the name, and a fourth one which is irrelevant because they get like 1%. none of these parties ever actually have an alternative opinion to United Russia, which is Putin's party, particularly on foreign policy, which is what we're focusing on here. Keep in mind, it's Russia is in quotations marks, a semi-presidential republic, which means it's similar to France in its political system. So Putin is actually part of a party, but yeah, we just think of Putin as this guy who is a part above the whole thing, largely because he is. So election not going to make any difference. If anything, maybe the turnout is really low and the Russians are a bit pissed off with the continued war fatigue that we were talking about from the Ukrainian point of view. And it's still happening in Russia, but Russia's economy is more resilient than the West has given it credit for. And mainly because, despite all the sanctions, countries are still trading with Russia. Luxury clothing is up like absurd amounts. Eggs are more costly than Gucci bags. I was reading in an Economist article just this morning. But even that, if you speak to Russians on the ground, which I do occasionally, eggs are not even that expensive. People seem to forget in the West that Russia has dealt with difficulty time and again, and whether or not you are supportive of the Kremlin or not, just from a very objective standpoint, Russia is a resilient country, and the people in Russia are quite content to deal with hardship because that's what they've been used to. They feel in the mentality that the world is out to get them in some ways, or that they are. And it's also what Putin's war machine, propaganda machine, has led them to believe. So despite the West's best efforts, which are not even their best, it's not working. So, but war fatigue is a thing, and people don't like this term because they think it means you're not supportive of Ukraine and the ultimate, belief in their freedom and sovereignty. That's different. Those two things are very different. I engage on this issue all the time, and because I talk from a place of pragmatism, people seem to think that I'm not compassionate or sympathetic to the Ukrainian situation. That is not the case. That's a conflation of details. I am looking at this situation and I'm as appalled as anyone with any real decency about them is of what has been the past 2 years. I don't think people are going to forget the Ukraine war, no, because it's just too big a deal for the world economy. It's too inset in our minds now. Even if you're not actively following it every day, you're still aware that Ukraine is a major component to everyday life now. I don't think it's going to be a forgotten war like, I don't know, somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa or other parts of Southeast. There's a civil war going in Myanmar at the moment between tens of thousands of rebels and the Tatmadaw. We don't really hear much about that. So and that's because Myanmar, unfortunately, is not an important part of the global economy. So the Ukrainian war is just too big, and also because it involves a great power or big power. So no, I don't think we're going to forget about it. Are we fed up with it? I do think that people are kind of immune or desensitized to the war now. If there's I've been in pubs where it's come on the news and I've actually seen people switch channels because I don't want to look at the war footage and stuff. It's pretty bleak. But does that mean it's going to play in directly to government policy? No. We said it before about the perspective of the general public to government views of, say, Palestine. Well, in the UK, right, Royfield, the public sentiment about the war in Gaza is very different to what the Prime Minister and the government are doing. They're still pretty largely in support of Israel, despite public sentiment being more on support of Gaza or Palestinians. And this may be the case with parts of the UK and other countries, right? The governments are going. I mean, Grant Shapps, the Defense Secretary of the UK, was giving a speech just today, and we will not relent until Ukraine is free and sovereign. But the general public, it's not that clear cut. So I do think the longer this war goes on, the less and less appetite there is for it to last. I don't like to call too much, but I am increasingly confident enough to say that I think this war will continue. but I do think we're going to see substantive changes in the type of potential support given by the West, the general public rhetoric around it. Biden has an election, and no incumbent president, and I can think of, has done exactly a good job of winning re-election when they've been stuck in the Middle East or whatever it is. Everybody constantly talks to me about how Trump, when he was president, never entered a war. America was never in a war when Trump was in office. And as far as I can think of, that's kind of true, but I don't necessarily put that down just purely to Trump. So that being said, Biden's got an uphill struggle for 24 election in the US, and that will increasingly become his priority. John Kerry's already dropped off as being special climate envoy to go and help with his re-election campaign. So you're seeing these shifts beginning to happen. And will it happen with Ukraine? Quite possibly. And this is where, to bring this round to sort of a wrap up, is that the Russians are infamous for strategical patience, their ability to outlast their enemy by just flinging, bodies at the problem. The Russians are not efficient, but they are effective in terms of just pure manpower. The more people you get at something, and that is something they have. They have 140 million people versus 40 million in Ukraine, right? Of which 4 million fled or whatever. So not saying that all of those people are going to come to fight, but you know what I mean? They have more people to pick from. And therefore, this war is just, if the Russians can hold out long enough, they might get what they want. Now, let's go into specifics. What did the Russians originally want? They wanted the removal of Zelensky and a de facto puppet state like Belarus. That's what they ultimately wanted. When they realized that their initial 3-day, 10-day invasion wasn't going to work, they reformulated their, goals and made it about Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson. These 4 oblasts predominantly make up what's known as Novorossiya, which is the Russian for New Russia, which was what the Russian Empire expanded into in the late 19th century and basically cuts off all of Ukraine, and also because its ethnic Russians are more present there. So this is what I think Putin is trying to settle on as well. But it's also, neither side can conduct an easy counteroffensive because of the fortifications. If the Russians push through, they're going to be attacked by HIMARS, artillery, all sorts. The Ukrainians are gearing up for the F-16s. The Russians still have air superiority, but it's, there's that question. And then if the Ukrainians push through, which they didn't do last year with the all build up for the counteroffensive, then they've got a heck of a load of mines, fortifications to deal with. Some estimations say that it would take decades, if not centuries, to demine Ukraine fully, eastern Ukraine, and the Russians.
Which is the reason why I framed it as: are we just looking at
basically, yeah. Sorry, I know I went on a tangent, but yeah, very simply, I can see this either. No country's going to win outright, because outrightly means the Russians take all of Ukraine or all of the territories that they want, or Ukraine wins outrightly, which is pushing them out completely and obtaining Crimea. Those are the 2 outright victories. Or you get marginal victories. Marginal victories is Ukraine gets back a bit of territory, or it just prevents the Russians from taking more, and it eventually has to accept that its eastern part has been lost, or it's no longer able to govern it, or whatever. Or a marginal victory for the Russians, which is they keep the territory that they own, and maybe they accept that the Ukrainians do join the EU, but not NATO, or they remain neutral, right? There are so many different variations which are similar but still distinctive in one way or another, based on the 6 demands that the Russians originally outlined in early 2022. So this can either be a frozen conflict, where it just goes on forever and they take pot shots, long-term artillery fire. It can be a DMZ, where it's a North Korea, South Korea, but with West Ukraine or just Ukraine and Russia. And the line of contact, the current line where the front lines are, becomes a hugely demilitarized zone. Who governs that? The UN? The Ukrainians will heavily militarize their eastern border, or new eastern border in this scenario, way more. And the Russians will, remilitarize elsewhere as well. But that means that's different to a frozen conflict, because it basically means the 2 sides are at an armistice, but they're not at a peace agreement because they've never signed it. Like the North Koreans and South Koreans are. They've never signed a peace agreement. They're still at war since 1952 or 51, whatever it was, right? Those are the scenarios. Or you get some political settlement, and Ukraine agrees that if they can have back Crimea, the Russians can keep what they've taken, or if the Russians keep Crimea, the Ukrainians can have back Kherson because the Russians control a tiny section of it, or the Russians agree that the Ukrainians can join the EU but not NATO, and they will reinstate the Russian language in the Ukrainian constitution, right? These are all the variations, but I cannot see for the life of me a political solution. So it's either frozen conflict, protracted conflict, barely moves, or some other, very high, radical scenario. But I don't think any of that's possible for a good long while. Definitely not by the end of this year, unless the Americans are actually like, Ukraine, you must change, because at the ultimately the Ukrainians are at the behest of the Americans because they rely on their support. The Ukrainians are developing their own military defensive systems and infrastructure and industries, but that's not going to come online. That's not going to be viable for a long time. So this war could just exist and nothing really happens, or it does actually wrap up and we have some kind of political settlement. But yeah, sorry for the long-winded reply.
No worries, but you have led me manfully on to talking about Taiwan and China, talking about frozen conflicts. In 2024, China faces ongoing tensions with Taiwan, a crucial issue affecting regional stability and international diplomatic relations. The country's economy has experienced a relative malaise sparked by a significant collapse in its property market, undermining a key growth driver and also a key growth driver for the world economy. Let's not talk too much about the Chinese economy, which this year's forecast to slow down to a growth of 4.6%. If only Britain had half of that, we'd be cock a hoop. But let's look at that frozen conflict, the conflict between Taiwan, the Republic of China, and the People's Republic of China, the mainland. How significant was the recent election in terms of maybe ratcheting up tension, the recent election in Taiwan in terms of ratcheting up tension between the island and the mainland?
Yeah, just done a lot on this, given it was on Saturday the 14th. I really recommend people to check out. We had a good conversation with China Uncensored, they're a big China channel, and it was really in-depth chat about this very thing. Now, it can be interpreted a few ways. Some analysts were arguing it's not going to make much difference because Lao Ching-te, if I said his name correctly, is the VP and he's now the head or the president. He took over from Tsai Ing-wen, his predecessor. It's the same party, it's the same bloody people. So it's not necessarily going to be a massive deviation from the current thing. For details, so the Taiwan the election was thrown a little bit because we had the entry of a third party called the TPP, headed by Ko Wen-je, and he won about 26.7% of the vote, which is pretty good considering that they've never really been that emergent in what has been largely a two-state party system. And then the KMT, which is the more pro-eventual Chinese unification, won about 33%. The DPP, which is the more pro-eventual independence of Taiwan, about 40%. So they won, the DPP won 52 seats, I think, and the KMT won 51 seats. So it's going to be up to the TPP to join up with one of the others, to join up the DPP on certain bills or legislation, obviously, to push it through. So that is important. But the key point of all of this really is that not any of them really said that they want to deviate away from the status quo. So quick 101 in Taiwan, Chinese US dynamics is that Taiwan lives and acts like an independent country, but is not recognized as an independent country bar, I think, about 10 nations. And what I didn't know until I had my conversation earlier today was that Nauru, a Pacific Island nation, has actually shifted from recognizing Taiwan to now China. So there, Taiwan has lost another international recognition. But yeah, so basically, the DPP largely wants to keep the status quo, but gradually push towards eventual independence. The KMT is the opposite. And the DPP have been incumbents for the past 10 years or so and have, resonated a lot with, I think, Taiwanese people. But as you said, there were some internal domestic issues for Taiwan voters. The youngsters particularly voted TPP, the third party, because he was pushing more about, housing, job, wage rates, these things that are also an issue. But China is omnipresent. So it's hard to really, not talk about Chinese politics because it's inevitable with Taiwan. But largely speaking, yeah, the election is important. It's not going to have a seismic impact probably as we think, hopefully. But does that mean China won't do something? Well, they already did. So the Taiwanese received a few, statements of congratulations. The Foreign Secretary of the UK was quoted as saying, it's a testament to Taiwanese democracy. And the Chinese basically said, we're not happy with this, guys. We urge you, quote, to stop any words or deeds that interfere in China's internal affairs. China sees Taiwan as an internal issue because they think it's just part of China already. Not much of the rest of the world does, even though we don't treat it as a nation. This is all what the US calls strategical ambiguity. Anyway, the Chinese responded with a statement, quote, they lodged their, quote, solemn representations with the United States over the US comments, as well as the Japanese. They said the same thing. That's really interesting for a couple of reasons. One, I don't really understand what solemn representation, I don't really understand what they mean. Second, it's important because the choice of wording. China is facing a lot of headwinds, as we've had on my channel a few times now, be them economic or demographic. Last year was a bad year for China, overtaken by India in population, demographic decrease of about 900,000. Economic data, they ceased from publishing. These sorts of things are not helping the Chinese cause. And they've had to soften the language that they use in their diplomatic communications with other countries. And you can even see this if you read Chinese media briefly, like Global Times. It's the national mouthpiece of the Chinese Communist Party. Very, very almost reconciliatory, constructive, hopeful for US-Chinese relations in the future. And so solemn sort of is a bit less aggressive than, say, antagonized, you know what I mean? So I definitely think the Chinese are trying to weather the storm a bit. Xi is also facing internal discontent. Just because he runs the party doesn't mean he's not, free of frustrations amongst people who think he's pushing the boat out by having a third term. Supposedly in Chinese politics, you're supposed to have 2-term limit, and he's, well, like Putin, completely throwing all that out the window. So China's facing a lot of uphill considerations, and you will definitely see, I think, more military posturing. So that means flyovers into Taiwan, not airspace, their bigger aerial area, more maritime pressures. So maybe more faking blockades, feinting, that sort of thing. But does it mean that suddenly we're going to see war between Taiwan and China with the introduction in the United States? I don't think so. The US is very much not wanting that. They've got, as we've touched upon, the Middle East and Ukraine to think about. The last thing Biden can manage is a third front, which would be the worst of all, because it's China and maritime. And yeah, so I think war fatigue in Ukraine is something that is going to be a problem, but I don't think it's going to be something that the Chinese take advantage of, just because the Chinese are not in the best position themselves, and no one's playing down the West's struggles, blah blah. Inevitably people are going to go, oh, he's just ignoring all the troubles the West has. No, we're not doing whataboutisms. We're very clear of the West's issues, but China is facing a lot of challenges, and I think Taiwan is not going to be the biggest hotspot potentially of the year as it could have well been. But wait for me to be incorrect about that, possibly.
Let's move on from the Far East and let's go to Africa, specifically the Horn of Africa, notably Ethiopia, which grapples with the devastating impact of a civil war disrupting the region's stability and humanitarian conditions. On January the 1st, Ethiopia and Somaliland signed a memorandum of understanding with potentially exchanging a stake in the Ethiopian Airlines for access to the Gulf of Aden. I think there's two really significant things here. That in effect, Ethiopia has given international recognition to Somaliland, not Somalia. And that they've been quietly going about their business for about 30 years with no international recognition. And then explain to us the geopolitical importance of Ethiopia having access to the Red Sea.
Yeah, this is a really important topic, and one very overlooked, not just this specific issue, but the whole Horn. I'm really glad you brought it up, because an important fact, not a fun fact at all, is that the Ethiopian civil war that happened between 2020 and 2022 was the bloodiest war of this millennia, of this century. More than 5 to possibly 1 million people died in that war, and we barely know about it because the world is so distracted by other things. And Ethiopia is still reeling from that. We've got tensions with Eritrea and Ethiopia, let alone now Somalia and Ethiopia. So I'm really glad you brought that up. But yeah, so basically a little bit of context here. Somaliland was a British colony until about 1960. The territory actually enjoyed about 5 days, I think, of independence before they actually chose voluntarily to rejoin Somalia, reunite, which was Somalia was a former Italian colony. And it was that union that was very volatile until the early 90s, which when Somalia tried to break away. And that led to the decade-long, I guess you'd say, war, really, internal war, which was backed by different groups. And the UN's catastrophically failed AMISOM missions 1 and 2, which actually made the situation worse. Now Somalia has its own currency, it has its own institutional framework, parliament even has its own.
Somaliland.
Somaliland. Somaliland has its own currency, its own parliament. It has its own diplomatic relations in certain cases. But Al-Shabaab is the other entity in this relationship, because Al-Shabaab is one of the most potent terrorist forces in the world. They're very particular to this part of the world, so you don't hear them as much as, say, ISIS, but they are very potent. And Somalia, encompassing Somaliland, has been one of the most dangerous countries in the world, and often at the bottom of these development index, peace indexes, and so on. The new deal with Ethiopia is quite fascinating, actually. So basically, it was as you said, it was a memoranda of understanding. It's an intent rather than a legally binding agreement, but it's clear that Somalia wants to grant Ethiopia access to this part of the Red Sea for commercial traffic through a port. Though it's not clear which port that would be. There's also a military aspect to this, which is that Somalia said it could lease, I think, a section of the coast to the Navy of Ethiopia, which was confirmed by Ethiopia. And Somaliland will get access to Ethiopian Airlines, which is quite a big carrier in Africa's relative terms. But what gets sticky is the willingness of Ethiopia to recognize Somaliland as an independent state, which no other country has done for 30 plus years. And there's a growing tension between Somalia and Somaliland over this issue, because for Somalia, Somaliland is an integral part of its country. It's not something that they would be able to accept, mainly because also Somaliland is one of the more prosperous parts of the country. Parts of Somaliland, I think, are more wealthy. Well, I mean, again, it's all relative, but there's more economic development or activity than in Somalia. And I believe there were protests relatively recently in Mogadishu against this deal. But the de facto president of Somaliland has pushed for this sort of agreement to include a section stating that it will be an independent country at some point, so no commitment to time. Now, this puts pressure on Ethiopia, and I don't think the reason Ethiopia is doing this, I think, is also because of the controversiality and sensitivities with Eritrea. Eritrea controls, the area north of Ethiopia's border. They fought sort of side by side against the Tigray people, the Tigrayan TPLF during the civil war, and but now there's tensions again. Djibouti is obviously another country here, but it's largely a small state with many countries using it as a military base for maritime operations, so they're not as implicated. But so Ethiopia has not much access to the Gulf of Aden, and then this part of the Red Sea, or run up to the Red Sea. So it's very interesting for them. They really want this access, and so Somaliland, excuse me, is trying to leverage that. But for Ethiopia, which is the third most militarily powerful state, one of the largest populated states in the whole continent, to suddenly go, yes, we recognize Somaliland, would be insane. Like going out on a whim, like that would cause repercussions across the continent. And Ethiopia's not exactly been loved by all African nations because of what's been happening on the ground in the past couple of years. So you really do have to put this in the context of the preceding couple of years. It's hard to, because I don't think this deal would have even really developed at this rate had it not been because of other elements that are preceding it. Egypt has said that they support Somalia. Just to give you a couple of foreign perspectives for a second, he said that the Somalian counterpart was stood by with Egypt and that they would guarantee its security and stability. Turkey also played a significant role because they actually have this fascinating fact. They have a space station, or like space presence, whatever, launching site in Mogadishu. Why, I don't know. What impact it has for Turkish foreign policy in the Horn of Africa, I'm not sure, but they do. So Erdogan is got some influence there, and said it stands by the commitment to Somalia's unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Pretty run-of-the-mill diplomatic statements. So I don't know what's going to happen with this. I don't think the Ethiopians are going to do much. They're not going to be pushed by the Somalilanders, and I don't think the Somaliland president will overdo it, because he's already got this much, and that's a pretty big win for a non-recognized state. The last point I'll make is it's incredibly difficult to get recognition as an independent state, mainly because you have the biggest recognition is whether other countries recognize you. And that's why South Sudan, 13 years ago, not too far down the road from this, was such a big deal. But ultimately, the international community felt that the emergence of South Sudan as a separate state to Sudan was important. But Somaliland versus Somalia, not sure, because it's in such a geopolitically sensitive and integral part of the world, the Horn, the Gulf of Aden, Yemen, Houthis. Certainly nothing will change, at least whilst the Gaza war is happening and the Houthis are doing what they're doing. So until that subsides, the war could erupt on the ground between Somalia and Ethiopia, sort of, possibly, but I don't want to make too many calls on that, and I really hope it doesn't happen. But yeah, I'll land there.
I must admit, when I heard of this back end of last year, I thought it was geopolitical chess played superbly by Abiy Ahmed. One of the key strategic faults of Ethiopia is, as you said, it's this massive population, about 100 million, and it's hemmed in because they have access to the sea. When Eritrea gained independence, it lost access to the sea, and all of its trade, maritime trade, fundamentally comes through Djibouti. And as you said, Djibouti is this tiny country which has so many international bases. The Chinese have a naval base here, the Americans, the French, you name it, the Turks, everybody does. And this is a way of them sidestepping that by giving recognition to Somaliland and then getting a small access to the sea. So in terms of just playing the checkerboard of geopolitics, it's a genius move. However, the ramifications of it, as you rightly said, are particularly seismic, because Somaliland has tried to get recognition for 30 years. And what it does then do is then potentially create Somaliland as being somewhat of a client state of Ethiopia, as well as then giving it access to the sea. But what I want to do now, because we do have a small audience with us, and we've only just gone through, we haven't even done half of the topics which I really wanted to in the hour, because we do have a small audience here. If you have a question for Pyotr about the topics which we've dealt with, or maybe that there is another bit of the globe which you think needs the light shining on it, now is your moment. But whilst you gather your thoughts, quick shout out to the many people who listen to the podcast. This is now going out on YouTube. So if you want to see how bald, how grey, and how flabby I am, log on to MidAtlantic Podcast on YouTube, and you can see me and my guests in 3D. Well, we're not in 3D, it's only 2D. You can see it's in full colour. However, there's a slight difference to these shows when they do go up. I do actually add more more video and more context to help embellish the whole story. So it's not just a recounting on video of the podcast. So please, for the love of all things holy, go over onto YouTube, MidAtlantic Podcast. Go and subscribe if you do nothing else, because the algorithm gods then look at me quite favorably and give me a little bit more traffic. But if you're in the audience, unmute yourself and ask a question to Pyotr Kurzin about the
Can't
world
imagine they
in
want to after
2024.
everything I've said and nodded off probably with my overly long-winded answers.
No.
Hypothetical. Dr. King's reaction to the state of the world today.
Was Dr. Martin Luther King particularly engaged on geopolitics? I think he was mainly focused on social issues, wasn't he?
No, he was. He actually was. He did give many sermons about international policies.
Well, I think that he would be proud of the South Africans doing what they're doing with the ICJ, I guess. You know, people talk about Nelson Mandela and what he would think about it, given he was, you know, the fighter against apartheid. So I think Martin Luther King would think that maybe. I think he would be absolutely, I want to use the right word, more than disappointed. He would be very saddened by the state of domestic US politics, I think, and the emergence of sort of populism and the sort of hostility of people on the fringes towards African Americans or just, you know, minorities. I think he'd be upset with the treatment towards those on the border, even if it is a growing issue. I think he'd be disappointed with the lack of compassion felt by many countries in the world, even if the West is changing in its dominance. But yeah, I think he'd be pretty startled, but I think he'd want to also emphasize a message of hope, because that's often what he would do. His speech is one of my favorite of all time. But that is quite a hard question to answer. I think he'd have some strong opinions about Africa in its current state and a desire for it to prosper more than it is, and for Western nations or other nations to stop interfering, I guess. But yeah, I think you just look at the world today with all its wars and destabilization and shit and be like, why can't we have more unity against, you know, real issues like, say, climate change or something, if he was ever someone who talked about that. So I don't know. Royfield, what do you think?
That was a good answer, Pyotr. I'll give you that. It really was.
Thanks.
Go, Royfield.
It was a good answer. When you read about Dr. Martin Luther King and what he believed economically, in an American lens in 2024, it's very left wing. It's not even halfway. It's not even halfway liberal in modern parlance. And being part of the political left in the 1960s, he would have sympathized with the Palestinian people. Not that Israel doesn't have a right to exist. You know, this is not a binary question at all. So in terms of geopolitics, I think what Pyotr actually nailed it, that actually he would be very, he would applaud South Africa for taking Israel to the International Court of Justice over genocide, because politically that's where he was aligned in the 1960s. And also the South Africa potentially has moral right, potentially is the wrong word, has moral right behind it in terms of launching such a thing. Not only is it an African country, sorry, I need to cough, I'm so sorry guys. Not only is it an African country, but but a real potent representative of the global South, but also it's showing real moral leadership, and it's something which he absolutely did. And we're recording this, of course, and Martin Luther King Day. So great question, Jim. Now, Dave, you have the opportunity to ask the last question, my friend. Your T-shirt says hope. I hope your question is going to do you justice, sir.
Oh, well, I guess so. I was just going to go back to the Ukraine situation. And I know that stalemate is kind of like the status quo for the last year from just measuring the battle lines. But what risks or potential changes would there be if some of the support from the West was able to, I guess, change the equation on air superiority. And it's becoming, to me, a little bit more clear that Crimea as an island is getting to be less reliable as a place to fall back for Russia.
Yeah, I think that yeah, look, I mean, the Ukrainians, well, I'll just give you my personal opinion actually without for once, which is that my perspective at the beginning of this year, beginning of last year was my position will shift, not necessarily change, but shift a little bit, depending upon how well the Ukrainian counteroffensive goes. It didn't. So I'm beginning to think about, well, what is the propensity for the Ukrainians to actually be able to make a change, make a difference? That is obviously without incorporating the factor of air support, air forces. F-16s are supposed to be coming or be near ready. Russia's still got, air superiority, and people are still curious as to why Russia hasn't leveraged that more. Maybe because they don't want to lose their jets, or maybe because their jets are not as good. We saw how Russian military performance competency was in the first few weeks of the war in 22. Not exactly, they ran out of tanks quite quickly and stuff, and bring up ones from 1970s and shit. So there is that component, but even if Ukraine begins to make some gains in the front, it's going to be slow and it's going to be costly. And I just don't know whether the West has that appetite, what's the word? Unconditional support in them going ahead. It's a really tough one to call. Also, because I'm conscious that people sort of, again, they hear what people will say in these sorts of ways, and they'll be like, "Oh, so you don't support Ukraine?" No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that's what I want to happen. I'm just saying that's what could happen. And yeah, the Ukrainians they're a very potent force in their own right, but they are going up against another force which is just, good at, well, strategical resilience, patience, and holding out. And Putin is holding out. It's not only about the battlefield, it's about the political dynamics. If Putin can hold out for suddenly Donald Trump keeps saying, "I'll end this war tomorrow or within 48 hours." So that's a real fear for the Ukrainians and a real reassurance or hope for the Russians. So it's tough. Crimea is definitely a problem growing for the Russians. The Ukrainians are making more decent strikes against maritime assets. They are making more confident, excursions into Russian naval, Russian maritime zones, and also into Russia itself. Remember those two drones that struck the Kremlin in May, if that was Ukrainians. So I definitely think that Crimea is not over with. People sort of like, oh, well, Ukraine should just give it up. Not necessarily, but Ukrainians can't, they can't get a foothold on mainland Ukraine. So I don't really see why they would then begin deviating separating some of their forces and putting it into Crimea to take back the island. Doesn't add much to the overall gains ultimately, I at least from my crude military understanding. So yeah, I still don't see things changing massively quickly. Obviously coming the spring months and then the summer, then we might see some shifts again, but we didn't see them last year. So why would we suddenly see them this year? Unless that's when the Ukrainians implement the F-16s, then it might be different, but that's really hard to forecast. So I don't know if that gives you a satisfactory response.
You made a really good point, Pyotr, which is Putin has been able, potentially, has the ability to see out the West, more patient. He can lose more resources and just keep going. And this is something which the Chinese always say about the West. The vagaries of our democratic system are such that we somewhat flip-flop. And the Russians and the Chinese are much more far-sighted in this regard. And to your point, you're incredibly correct that if Trump wins the presidency, that stops all military support for Ukraine overnight. Like there is no more. So if the Russians can just see out this year and have more than just the capability of doing that, potentially it takes the knees from underneath the Ukrainians in terms of current levels of Western support. But and after saying that, just 2 days ago, Rishi Sunak has pledged £2.3 billion to help Ukraine. But still, right, the Americans are by far the largest supporter of Zelensky and the Ukrainians. On that note, everybody, I'm going to thank our friend Pyotr Kurzin for being with us here on MidAtlantic. Pyotr, tell us all about your wondrous YouTube channel, your podcasting works, and what you've got in the bag for people coming up soon.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me, Royfield. It's been a real pleasure. I'm glad to have finally joined you on the MidAtlantic podcast, both video and audio format. And, big fan of the work, although we've had, I think I've made a few comments here and there in the past on other episodes. And I've loved the community on here. So people, if they haven't, joined Royfield when he has these guests on Zoom, it's a nice interactive style. For myself, I run the Global Gambit podcast, both in Spotify and Apple formats, but on YouTube. Well, YouTube is increasingly my big passion, and a lot of things I don't put on the audio podcast, I do put on the channel. We've had guests from Brigadier General Robert Spalding to Francis Fukuyama to Peter Foster of the Financial Times, and I'm working on some other exciting things this year. I'm going to start posting on my own content, so you can just find it by Googling my name or the Global Gambit on YouTube. And love to have you as part of the community, and look forward to collabing with you in the future, Royfield.
2024, sir, is our year to collab. If you want to communicate with me, send me an email at royfield@gmail.com. I tell you what you can do when you send me an email. Apart from just berating me, you can also say, hey, why don't you follow this topic or do a show on that topic? And to that note, somebody did email me just last week and say, why don't you do a show on Canadian domestic politics? So we're going to do that on this Thursday. We don't put up all of our shows actually on YouTube. What we do is the inform long depth interviews. We put those up on YouTube. So if you're listening to the podcast, please go over there. Please go and subscribe. Give them a watch. Tell your brother, tell your mother, tell your sister that MidAtlantic is on the YouTubes. Love to see you over there. And on that note, from Pyotr Kurzin and myself, it's goodbye, arrivederci, and ciao. And we'll see you all for another rip-roaring, barnstorming episode of MidAtlantic, where we'll look at either US, UK, or maybe geopolitics in the round. Take care. Look after yourselves. Bye-bye.
Ta-ra.
Ciao.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for being part of this.